influence of corporate money and dark money in our politics is just terrible. It's what's preventing Congress from really moving on so many needed reforms. My campaign, last time and this time, I've pledged not to take a single penny from any industry-funded PAC. No corporate money in my campaigns whatsoever. And we've been committed to taking money in small donations online. And we did a great job last time in 2016. I think our average donation size was about $17. So they were calling me Mini Bernie, since Bernie's was $27 and ours was $17. And we had a couple of 100,000 small donations online, and it gave us the resources we needed to build a really great ground game. I'd like to see Citizens United overturned by constitutional amendment or even by legislation that crafts a certain section in it which would strip the Supreme Court of the jurisdiction to review that legislation, which that's a sort of a nuclear option, but it's in the Constitution. I'd like to see publicly financing of elections the way they have in many European countries, and also opening up the airwaves, free time for candidates so that they can get their messages across. We need election integrity, and that's on the CFAR pledge. And I know this probably more than maybe any other candidate in the country, I'll tell you that, because when our race ended in 2016, we had some serious questions about the outcome. We were knocking on 10,000 doors a week and ranking voter engagements. So it was a very big, you could say, sample size, bigger than any of the phone surveys that the newspapers do based on a few hundred people who only have landlines. And our numbers showed a much different result than the final result, than us losing. So it took a while, but a couple of months after the election, we put in the first of 3 public records requests to inspect the ballots. And the supervisor of elections of Broward County jerked us around for about 6 or 7 months. I then finally filed the lawsuit last June. And while the lawsuit was pending, the supervisor of elections destroyed all of our paper ballots in violation of federal law, state law, and the court's authority as well. They actually certified that the ballots were not the subject of pending litigation when they were. So, this is outrageous. It leaves us with only the scanned images, and the scanned images without the paper ballots to back them up doesn't give much assurance, because the scanned images, guess what? They can be manipulated through computer software manipulation, whether it's the Russians or corporate interests that are manipulating it. So we stand very firmly for paper ballots to be counted by hand in public, not just as they're doing all over Europe where they've banned these electronic voting machines, but as we in this country did for many decades. Mm-hmm. Also on the CFAR contract is to rebuild this country, to rebuild the infrastructure. I've been writing about this as a legal scholar for many years. I'm a law professor, and what I teach about is the Federal Reserve and public banking. And our country has a very strong history during the New Deal, the 1930s, 1940s, and even into the 50s, of, first of all, a national infrastructure bank. It was called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And even the Federal Reserve was directing resources not just to Wall Street, but to Main Street. So we need to come up with these kinds of public financing mechanisms so that we can afford to rebuild our infrastructure without putting it on credit cards, without running up deficits. I know their modern money theory says you can run deficits. I understand that. I don't disagree. But politically, it's very difficult to do in Washington. You have these pay-as-you-go rules. So let's have some public banking, use those public banking resources to rebuild the nation's infrastructure. We know here in Florida, better than anywhere else maybe, that we need to rebuild. Where Florida has a lot of unique problems, but maybe they're not so unique anyway, after all. The rising sea levels are beginning to corrode the infrastructure. We need to convert very quickly from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources. And that's what a lot of that kind of infrastructure investment would go towards.
Right. So I was thinking it did seem like kind of a no-brainer that you would sign CFAR when I looked at your platform and what you've supported for decades, really.
Yes.
So, yeah, it does seem like election integrity. Now, that item actually wasn't on CFAR at the time you signed it when Michelangelo Hamilton reached out to you, but it is now. and we plan to talk to every candidate. We interview every CFAR candidate about election integrity, and that's something we'll definitely be following up on.
It's been a learning experience. The 2016 election cycle was a real learning experience of how flawed our election system really is. There are international studies that show the United States, out of major democracies, is dead last in election integrity. It's shameful.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to get into that, and we're going to segue into a separate interview here shortly, where I'm very excited. We're going to have Lulu help me pronounce her last name correctly. Freistad. Okay. Join us, and I'm really excited about that. So what would you say, how do you plan to, I guess, deploy CFAR in, like, against your opponent, who is Debbie Wasserman Schultz? How do you, I mean, you'll have that edge that she doesn't have.
Well, it's true. And, CFAR is all about the issues, and that's what our campaign is about. Wasserman Schultz is a very typical kind of career incumbent politician who tries to deflect away from any serious discussion of the issues. And it's always sort of an inside the beltway conversation that's going on. There's only so much you could say about Donald Trump, his character, the Russian investigations, and all of this. And after a while, when you keep harping on it, when you hear people like Wasserman Schultz keep harping on it, you realize what they're really doing is trying to run out the clock and not talk about the issues that matter to ordinary folks, because Debbie Wasserman Schultz is in the pocket of all of these big corporate interests. And, folks go to opensecrets.org. You can see where all of these politicians, all candidates raise their money from. And when you look up Wasserman Schultz, you'll see during the course of her career, she has taken millions of dollars from big Wall Street banks, predatory payday lenders, private prison corporations, fossil fuels. The list is endless. Mm-hmm. So she talks like a liberal Democrat. She tries to pretend she's progressive, whatever she thinks that means. But she's a corporate-funded politician who follows the corporate line. So we have continued to hammer her on all of the CFAR issues, one by one. Mm-hmm. If I can get her into a debate, maybe I can put the CFAR contract right in front of her and ask her if she'll sign it. And that might be a tactic that we can, deploy during the course of this campaign. Mm-hmm. Last campaign, we built up a great field operation. Just to give you sort of an idea of the metrics, Bernie Sanders had one field office in all of South Florida. Now, he got into Florida a little bit late. There's all kinds of reasons that I think his campaign was constrained here. But during our congressional campaign, we had 4 field offices in our 1 congressional district. And we built an army of hundreds of volunteers and field organizers. And I already mentioned we were knocking on 10,000 doors a week. Well, that's not just dropping literature off. That is having well-trained, well-informed volunteers and field organizers of all ages. There were a lot of millennials, no doubt, but of all ages, who are engaging voters on their doorsteps, in their living rooms, expressing to them what our issues are, what our stances are on all of these issues, but also listening and bringing information back to me and the rest of the campaign as to the kinds of issues that are resonating in our district. And it's not surprising. I think it's the kind of issues that resonate all over this country right now. We see the decline of our public schools, K-12. Here, teachers are paid terribly in Broward County and Miami-Dade County. There's mold growing in the classrooms, so there's sick places. I'm sorry, on this day of all days, we see how unsafe the schools are. Just yesterday in Broward County, another terrible, tragic mass school shooting that took 17 lives. So we see a real decline in not just the public schools, public infrastructure. There's pressures to privatize the water systems right here in North Miami Beach, for instance. So you have this privatization agenda, including for mass transit. The public sector is being strangled. People are having to pay, if it's not taxes, they have to pay a covert form of taxes, you could say. Rising insurance premiums, paying higher and higher fees to these cartels that seem to feast off of us as consumers and as workers. And folks are, insecure about the job market. I know we hear that we're near full employment. with a 4% unemployment rate. But, somebody said to me, yeah, that's because everybody's now working as an Uber driver. And, this is what's becoming of our economy, where, folks who are used to having at least some stability, a job with some benefits, suddenly have to scrape together, 3 or 4 consulting jobs, living week to week, month to month, paying their bills. Mm-hmm. Well, what's happening at the same time is the top 1%, and really the top 1/10 of 1%, the studies are showing, are getting fantastically wealthier every single day. 94% of the income gains since the 2008 financial crisis have gone to the top 1%.
Mm-hmm. Well, you could always get a payday loan, right?
Well, and that's Wasserman Schultz's approach. That's right.
I wanted to ask you if you knew what more you knew about that. I know that she had voted against changing laws about payday loan. Do you know anything?
You go all the way back to her experience as a state legislator before she got to Congress, and she helped craft Florida's law, which allows interest rates on payday loans of over 300%. And she says that's the model because otherwise these folks will have to go to loan sharks. Well, it sounds like loan sharks in suits to me. Mm-hmm. In Congress, she was pushing a Republican bill that would have prevented President Obama's and Elizabeth Warren's Consumer Financial Protection Bureau from regulating payday loans for a 2-year period. And we shamed her into finally backing away from that. But her heart and soul is with them. She's taken so much money, not just from the payday loan industry, where I think she's taken almost $70,000, but the big Wall Street banks that provide those lines of credit for those payday lenders. She's taken a lot more from Wall Street. So look, as a law professor who writes and studies financial markets and regulation, for a long time, I've talked about the need to return to postal banking. The United States used to have a postal banking system. Our post offices would have no-frills checking accounts from the 1930s during the New Deal until it got privatized in the mid-1960s. There's the Bank of North Dakota as a model. There's all kinds of models for public banking or community banking, and unfortunately, that's not the way the game's been played now for decades. Instead, the Federal Reserve has been helping the biggest Wall Street banks consolidate, get bigger and bigger, while community banking gets smaller and smaller.
Right. Well, this is what CFAR contract does, is separate the people that are saying they're going to do these things and the people that actually mean it, like you, and will do it. Let's see. How do you plan to pay for things on CFAR?
So what things in particular? When you take a look at infrastructure, which is a big part of CFAR, right? We're talking about $4 trillion maybe that needs to be invested. I've heard even larger figures. Again, I'd go back to a national infrastructure bank. I mentioned the Reconstruction Finance Corporation during the New Deal. But today, China, Japan, Germany, and many other countries have public national infrastructure banks. The United States doesn't. Bill Clinton campaigned for one in 1992. Barack Obama campaigned for one in 2008. But it never became so important once they were in office for the Democrats to really move it through committees and vote on it and make it a reality. That should really be priority number one for Democrats. Because if you have those kinds of national infrastructure banks, you can start to afford to rebuild this country. Again, if you do it the way Trump's trying to do it is terrible. It's essentially this public-private partnerships means privatization. And, so the public sector will pony up some of the money and they'll do it through the bond markets. If we want to rebuild our sewage system here, let's say in Hollywood, Florida, where I live, we're going to have a city go into the municipal bond market and borrow in that way. I'll tell you, over the course of a decade, the taxpayer will pay for it twice, once in principal and once in interest. But if you have a national infrastructure bank that's essentially funded by the Federal Reserve, you don't pay any interest. And that's the way finance used to be for the public sector. But if you play by Wall Street rules, it's not going to get done.
Right.
Now, tuition-free higher education, I think that's a CFAR pledge as well. And I've been calling for it. I'd like to see a national service program as well, so that if folks serve their country for 2 or 3 years, whether civilian or military, and ideally civilian service, that they could get tuition free, not just at a public college or university, but any college or university. And that was really the model of World War II and the GI Bill. My dad was served in the armed forces during World War II. 16 million Americans in uniform came back and were eligible for tuition-free higher education, public or private university, anywhere in the world with living stipends. I know part of the plan that I know Bernie Sanders has advocated, and I think CFAR, and I agree with it, is let's have a Robin Hood tax, a small transaction tax on financial transactions. The volume of financial transactions on a daily basis are so enormous now that even a small little tax of a few cents on the dollar or a fraction of a penny on the dollar can raise so many hundreds of billions of dollars that it can pay for an awful lot of this.
Yes. Okay, so I think we should segue into talking with Lulu about election integrity and maybe some more specifics on your case. But thank you so much, and we're so glad you've signed CFAR, and we'll be building an army of activists. Maybe some of those people that were knocking on doors for your campaign might want to join in with specifically with CFAR.
That'd be wonderful. That'd be wonderful. And you can count on me to keep fighting for the agenda. Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kelly.